Hi guys, I'm Calder from Calder's Ceramics, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to make a yarn ball. I will first be throwing a normal ball on the polish wheel and then I will be turning it into a yarn ball by cutting out a curl. So without any further ado, let's head over to my wheel and get started again. The ball that I'm going to make is going to be quite high, and I'm also going to make it a bit closed at the top. That way the yarn won't fall out that easily. And I'm using 1000 grams of clay, but you can of course make this in any size you'd like. And what I always do, I start with centering the clay, so I cone it up and I press it down, and I repeat this multiple times. Then I press it down quite far because the ball is going to be quite wide and I like to start off with the wider base in that case. So I press the clay downwards with my fist and then I start opening it up. I take a sponge in my hands and I press it into the middle of the clay and then I pull the clay outwards towards myself. I do this with both of my hands and I'm using a sponge so that the clay doesn't stick to my fingers. Sometimes the clay becomes a bit too wide, then I press it back into the middle by holding my hands around it. And then I went over the bottom an extra time to make sure that it was nice and flat and it was thin enough. Then I made sure the sides were straight again, and then I got rid of some water that was on the inside, and then I started pulling up the walls. I take a sponge in my right hand and I press towards my left hand on the inside while making an upwards movement. And I repeat this multiple times to get the clay higher and the walls thinner. And as you can see, I first press the clay a little bit more towards the middle and then I turn it into a cylinder. Because I'm making a wider shape, it becomes wider quite easily because of the spinning of the wheel. So I prefer to first make some height before you pull it outwards, otherwise the piece might collapse. So I just go over it multiple times and I press the clay from the bottom all the way up to the top. And I also like to hold the thumb of my left hand on top of my right hand, because that way I can move both of my hands at the same time. And then when I have the height that I want, I make the ball a bit more round. So I press from the inside outwards and make it into the shape that I like. And then the ball is already finished and I go over it with a sponge to get rid of any water or slip that's on the piece. And then I take this wooden knife to cut away some extra clay at the bottom, and I also clean my bed with this. And then the throwing part is done and the piece is ready to dry before it's leather hard. For me this takes about a day. The next day I place it upside down on top of my giving grip and I start trimming it. I first take a small trimming tool to make sure that the bottom is nice, flat and centered, because this sometimes becomes a little bit uneven from cutting it off the bed. And then I start to cut away more clay from the sides. I always have a little bit of excess clay here, so I just get rid of this by trimming this away. And I also use this tool that's a bit bigger and flat, which makes it easier to make it into a fluent shape. And when I'm done with shaping the outside, I always like to make a foot ring on the bottom. And then the trimming is done, and to smooth it out I take a wet sponge and I go over the whole piece. And then I take this trimming tool and I go over it again. This trimming tool helps me to get rid of the water and slip from the sponge and also helps me to smooth it out. And then I go over it with my finger to completely smooth it out so that I don't have to do any sanding. And then it's time for the more difficult part, which is cutting out the curl. I first like to draw on the curl that I'm going to cut out, so for this I'm using this tool with a little ball on the end. And I'm just softly pressing it into the clay. I don't do this too deep or anything, just so that I can see it. But in case you mess up here, you can just get rid of these lines by going over it with a wet sponge. And just like that I draw a curl in the shape that I like. And what I always like to do is make a circular hole in the middle. That way you don't have any sharper corners there and it's easy to keep the yarn in there. I like to make this with a hole maker, so I just place the hole maker onto the ball and then slowly press it inwards and then pull it out, and then I have a perfect circular hole. If you don't have a hole maker or you don't want a hole in the middle, you can just cut it with a little knife. And then I take this little knife from Seam Tools and I start cutting out the curl. I found out that the clay was quite hard and it was quite difficult to get the knife through it, so I decided to soften this a bit by taking a wet sponge and dabbing this on top of the piece and give the clay some time to take up the water. And then as you can see, it's much easier to press the knife through the clay. And for me the rim was the hardest part, so down here it was a bit easier to cut. And as you can see, sometimes when it's hard I move the knife a little bit, but sometimes you can just press it to the clay, if you know what I mean. And here the clay was again a little bit hard, so I just took a wet sponge and dabbed a bit of water on top of it, and then it was easier to cut. And just like this, I carefully cut the whole piece. And the more you cut away, the more fragile the piece gets. So as you can see here, it moves quite a lot. So I would recommend to hold the piece together with your other hand, otherwise it might break. And then the first line of the curl was finished and I started to make the second line to actually cut it out. But before I did this, I also went over it with a wedge sponge to make it a bit softer, because this makes the cutting go a bit easier. And as you can see, I can now easily press the knife through the clay and cut out the spiral or curl. I don't know the difference. And when you're working on the inside part here, it's the most fragile because the whole piece starts moving, as you can see, which is kind of scary. Just try to hold it with your other hand and try to hold it still and then carefully cut it out. And then the cutting part is almost finished and I take away the clay that I just cut out. And then if necessary, you can define the shape a little bit more by just cutting away a bit of clay at parts where you want the opening to be a bit wider. I would recommend to make the curl not too thin, because the clay can warp a little bit in the kiln and then close the curl, which is not great. And then I take the small trimming tool and I cut away a little bit of clay on all of the edges. This way I make it nice and round and get rid of any sharp edges. And then take a wedge sponge and go over all of the sides to make it nice and smooth and nice and round and get rid of any small lines. And then at the end there was a little bit of slip in the middle here, and I got rid of this by going over it with this tool that I also used to mark the spiral. And then the piece is finished and ready to dry before biscuit fire. After it has been biscuit fired, I started glazing it, and I decided to decorate this piece with some purple underglaze. So I put some underglaze into this little bottle and then I started making dots. I decided to make dots all over the rim and also around the curl. I think it looks quite nice and it highlights the shape of the curl. I decided to just make one line of dots around the curl and around the rim, but you can of course also make multiple lines underneath each other with different colors, or just play with any patterns you'd like. And then after the underglaze has dried, I applied 2 coats of clear glaze, and I'm using zinc-free clear glaze from Emco, and it's important to let the glaze dry in between coats. And then the piece is finished and ready to go into the kiln for a glaze fire. And here are some pictures of the final result. That was it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked it and learned something new from it. If so, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done it yet. And if you're going to make this yarn ball yourself and you're going to post it on Instagram, please tag me at Calder because I would love to see it. I hope to see you next week. Bye!